Welcome to this special Facebook Live of Netra News, and um, we are here today to discuss one of the hottest news items in recent times in Bangladesh, and that is the United States government imposing sanctions on Rapid Action Battalion. I am Someone is saying no sound. Can you hear me? If from the audience, if you can tell me if you can hear me. I need a comment confirming that the sound is all right. Yes, the sound is all right. Thank you, Mamun Khan. Thank you very much. Anyway, back to the show. My name is Tasneem Khalil. I'm the editor-in-chief of Netra News, and today I am joined by an expert on sanctions. He is the Asia Director at Human Rights Watch. Uh, Welcome to the show, John Sifton. John, how are you?
Great. Thanks for having me.
John, let me start um, with something I actually wrote about you back in November 2018. That's a long time back. Um, you were actually speaking at a hearing at the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, and there you basically suggested that the U.S. authorities and the Congress should actually impose sanctions on the Bangladeshi law enforcement agencies who are involved and engaged in gross human rights violations. After that, and you actually proposed using the Global Magnitsky Act to impose these sanctions, targeted economic sanctions. Finally, we see that they have paid heed to your advice, but it took so long. And why do you think, these things take so long to materialize, to become real?
Well, it's been a long time documenting these abuses, even before 2017. Human Rights Watch was reporting on RAB abuses 10 years ago. And we wrote a report in 2013 where we didn't advocate sanctions because at that point there were no sanctions regimes in place. The United States only passed its human rights sanctions laws in 2016. But we did urge back in the 2013 report and earlier was that the United States cut off the Rapid Action Battalion from any assistance from the US military and any training. And they did. So even back then, there was already a sanction in a way on the unit. But when we made these reports in 2017 and then subsequently, more recently, we were attempting to move ahead a process which we know takes a long time with any country. The US State Department and the US Treasury Department have a very strenuous set of legal standards, and they have to be very careful about who they list and what the evidence is, because somebody who's listed technically they can challenge it. They can bring a court case in the United States and challenge it, and that's within their rights. But the Treasury Department wants to make sure that they have a solid case that they can argue why this person was sanctioned. And often it's just not one source or one allegation. It has to be multiple, credible documentation of somebody's complicity in gross human rights abuses. And that's what they got eventually from us, from the RFK Center, from brave Bangladeshi groups that assisted, and from other sources. And they got it, and they finally made the decision. But it unfortunately is a process that takes a lot of time, and I wish it could go faster, but unfortunately it doesn't.
So there is before I actually move into the, like actual discussions about implications and impact, there is this very strong criticism from the Bangladesh government and the ruling party side. I'll show you an example of that, and I want your comment on this. So here is Shujib Wajid Joy, who is the ICT advisor to Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina and also her son. He lives in the United States. Um, he basically posted this in connection with this criticism that the United States itself has so much police violence, so much killing going on there, that it has no, you know, ethical standing or a right to criticize a country like Bangladesh and impose sanctions against Rapid Action Battalion because, thousands of people get killed by the police every year in the United States. And Human Rights Watch has actually worked on police violence in the United States. So I would like to get your view on that. How do you distinguish police violence and extrajudicial executions?
Right. It's a good question, and I respond in two ways. One is that, yes, Human Rights Watch works on police brutality all over the world, and we've written reports on the United States. We've written reports about Vietnam, India, many other countries. And police killings are a serious issue in the United States. The numbers presented in that graphic are wildly misleading because they conflate killings that could be pursuant to a legitimate encounter and a legitimate use of legal force with the far more grave issue, which is repeated instances in which police use excessive force, often against African Americans, during police stops, during traffic stops, during home encounters. The police also have a terrible record when it comes to dealing with people who have mental health difficulties in the United States. It's a huge problem, and it's driven by poor oversight, lack of accountability, deep-seated racism. The United States has deep-seated racial problems, and the police often are, the vanguard of how racism becomes deadly because they, have this capacity to use violence with the backing of authority. So it's a huge problem in the United States, but it is in stark contrast with a phenomenon where killings are directed by the state against particular people because of what they said or what they're doing or who they are politically and what they've done. That's a completely different phenomenon. I mean, the result is the same. It's a homicide, unjustified homicide. But the context is entirely different. And what we're trying to get at with RAB is a unit that was designed and tasked with carrying out arrests and killings of particular targeted groups of people. And it was an organized effort. These are organized efforts. And when we talk about RAB being a unit, we're talking about not random, racially motivated police brutality. We're talking about targeted killings of individuals. We've also documented cases of kneecappings and shooting people in the legs and things like this. And these are pursuant to authorized policies, not pursuant to just impunity and racism, like in the US. If the United States had a special unit in its military or FBI that was tasked to go after Black Lives Matter protesters or anti-environmentalists or whatever, we would definitely give it the same attention that we're giving RAB. But that's not what we're talking about here. It's a completely different context. In any case, we've criticized both because in both cases, there needs to be.
John, let me interject there. Sorry.
Yeah,
I mean, I remember one of the former US ambassador to Bangladesh. He basically was praising RAB and saying that RAB can one day become the Bangladeshi version of the FBI. While at the same time, Human Rights Watch was actually describing RAB as a death squad. So don't you think like there is this disconnect between what the U.S. government has been saying about RAB in a way endorsing its
yeah,
actions, and how human rights organizations have been criticizing it?
yeah. I mean, we can't talk about the United States saying one thing or another thing in the abstract, because the fact is it's changed, and we've criticized the State Department for not being consistent. We've criticized the State Department for not being clear about its concerns, or clear enough about the concept of RAB as a unit, because RAB is a little bit complicated. Unlike, say, Kopassus in Indonesia, another death squad that was cut off from the U.S. military assistance programs, it is a fluid unit in which people come, they're seconded, and then they leave, and so the personnel change over time, and it's hard to pinpoint who's responsible, whether the unit now is responsible for the abuses of the past, whether a person who's in the unit now but who wasn't responsible for past abuses, are they complicit? Those are very difficult questions, and the U.S. has not navigated them well over the years. But I think now with these sanctions, it's clear that the unit itself needs to be disbanded. That regardless of whether you come in and you're new, or whether you've left and you're not part of RAB, the unit needs to be disbanded. But more importantly, the United States is sending a message to global Magnitsky sanctions that governments need to hold people accountable when they commit abuses. And the United States is not blameless in this regard. They have a terrible track record in holding their own troops responsible for reckless use of lethal force in Iraq and Afghanistan. But when people are shown to have intentionally killed, they're held accountable. And that's essentially what we're talking about here. There needs to be investigations and accountability. And it may not be perfect, but something is better than nothing. I mean, the United States is not perfect. Their investigations into their own war crime in Iraq and Afghanistan are not perfect by any means, and we've criticized them strenuously again and again and again. But they work sometimes, and at least it's something. Whereas in Bangladesh, there's nothing.
John, let's move to one of the key questions we have for you tonight. I'm showing a tweet by you from actually February, and you were talking about Myanmar. Here you say it's one of the myths that there are no assets to sanction in the European Union or US jurisdictions. Sanctions are not just about assets. Sanctions imposed by the US Treasury, UK, the EU, and other jurisdictions have extremely broad international consequences. And you have attached like a screenshot of a transaction being blocked.
Yeah.
That for effect, I will say. So here is my question to you. I mean, this is something we are wondering about Bangladesh. We have the Rapid Action Battalion that has been sanctioned by the US Treasury. 6 of their former and current commanders, including the current IGP of Bangladesh, Benazir Ahmed, their names are on the OFAC SDN list. And now, what are the implications for them individually, as for and for RAB as an institution? Like they can say, well, I mean, if there is someone, if I'm one of the guys sanctioned, I can say, well, I don't have any assets in the United States, so I'm not bothered about it. I'll go somewhere else if I want to, or send my kids to study in Europe. So what do you say to that, and how do you explain this?
Well, first of all, we'd hope that the United Kingdom and the EU, the European Union, and Australia and Canada will follow suit with similar sanctions. So it won't just be a question of the United States. And then as far as the implications go, if you have no assets in the US, that's the tip of the iceberg. Most major international transactions in the world today take place over the US dominated international banking system, including the SWIFT system. And there are whole hosts of transactions that you simply cannot engage in if you're on the SDN list, regardless of whether you have assets in the US. And so let's say Benazir wants to purchase something and send money to a company in Singapore, and they invoice in dollars. How is he going to pay that? If his daughter needs some money in the United States to pay for tuition or something, how is he going to send it to her? In addition, many members of the Bangladeshi military and police are part of UN peacekeeping forces or wannabe. It's almost certain to be the case that nobody on this list will be allowed to receive training to be peacekeepers, which is usually done by the US and the EU and others and the UK, let alone would the UN take them, because there is a vetting process in the United Nations which would almost certainly bar them from these frankly lucrative postings overseas. Our hope is, on one level, that all other members of the Bangladeshi military see what's going on here and recognize that if they take part in atrocities or abuses or extrajudicial killings, they're not going to be able to travel to Europe, the UK, or the US. They're not going to be able to use the international banking system. They're not going to be allowed to be UN peacekeepers. And, large avenues of their life will be impacted. So assets are really just the tip of the iceberg.
John, we actually asked the United Nations for their comments on this specific topic, and let's discuss. Let's unpack that a little bit here. What the deputy spokesperson for the UN Secretary General, actually told us that they are aware of the reports surrounding sanctions on RAB. We asked them how that might actually affect the vetting process, but they were quite ambiguous at this stage. So that's actually one of the questions everyone in Bangladesh is wondering right now. I mean, if specialists, for example, I am a military officer in Bangladesh. I'm either a major in Bangladesh Army, or maybe I'm a pilot in the Air Force. And, I know that in a few years' time, I'm waiting for, being deployed as a UN peacekeeper in some mission. But before that, I'm supposed to be, on deputation to RAB and, serve there for a few years and then go there. So, shall I be worried? Shall I think, well, hang on, if I go to RAB, then, my door to United Nations peacekeeping mission would be just shut off on my face. What are the things I should worry about really here?
I think a member of the Bangladeshi military should indeed be worried if they have served in RAB in the past or they're asked to serve in RAB in the future. It very much will impact the UN vetting process. Can a individual person who's not sanctioned make a case that they are clean, as it were, that they are not involved in abuses, and convince the United Nations Department of Peace Operations? Yeah. And I think if you're clean, if you've not committed abuses, and you want to be a peacekeeper, you could explain that. You could write a memorandum. You could explain why you're clean, and that might work. But yes, RAB is now a sanctioned unit, and the UN will almost certainly, I can say without a doubt, will be subjecting Bangladeshi military forces to heightened scrutiny simply to find out if they were members of RAB. But if they find out they are, will be subjecting them to even higher scrutiny about their past. And so, yes, this is a cause for concern.
No, but John, but United Nations says that the responsibility for vetting these peacekeepers actually lie with the national government. So, like the
Yeah, I think that's
sending,
they
yeah.
say that they say that, but I'm just saying as somebody familiar with the process and with also with Sri Lanka, which has a similar problem because of its military's complicity in war crimes at the end of the war in Sri Lanka in 2009. Yes, the ultimate responsibility lies with the government, but the UN does do vetting, and they will do vetting here. They may not say that because they don't want to make themselves the ultimate responsibility if somebody does get through, but they will be doing it. But also keep in mind, people who've never served in peacekeeping before have to get training in peacekeeping. Who does that training? Typically, it's the United States or the UK or other NATO countries. I mean, sometimes it's India, but almost always it's those countries. That training as a form of military assistance is now barred. And so you can't get the training that you need to be a peacekeeper because of these sanctions. So it's not just about the United Nations.
There is another question related to United Nations peacekeeping. I understand that United States is one of the largest sponsors, financially and technical assistance-wise, to the peacekeeping missions, right? Peacekeeping department itself. So, do you think, like, when there is this talk between United States and the United Nations about vetting, about peacekeepers, do you think the United States usually, demands that people who are sanctioned or units that are sanctioned by the United States should not actually, benefit from United States funding of the UN peacekeeping missions? It's just a political, bureaucratic question
Yeah,
in sort of a way. If you can,
it's a good question. I wish they did actually. I think they don't demand it. They don't pressure it. The pressure comes when it comes to the training that I just alluded to before selection. But unfortunately, the Department of Peace Operations and the United States, they have a heavy reliance on peacekeeping, and so they have an incentive not to cut people off. And since Bangladesh is one of the biggest contributors, they're not going to be like very aggressive in pressing these issues. But there's a tension between that and the fact that they don't want to be seen as, on the one hand, sanctioning RAB, and on the other hand, letting its members serve as peacekeepers. So there will be scrutiny. They don't want somebody who's implicated in extrajudicial killings to be serving as peacekeepers. How aggressively are they going to push the UN to vet? I don't know, but they don't want. And unfortunately, the United States all too often relies on civil society and journalists to expose these cases. They're not out there aggressively documenting human rights abuses on their own. Make no mistake, these designations were made because of the reporting of brave Bangladeshi civil society human rights defenders, Human Rights Watch documenting abuses, journalists. I mean, it's we who created the factual pattern that led to these sanctions, not the US on its own.
Here, I'd like to speak to my audience who are live right now. We have like around 200 people watching live right now. If you want to ask John Sifton any question, please use the comment function. We have a moderator who is selecting some of the comments, which I will eventually look at and select a few of them and put them to John. Um, and also we don't um, uh, actually tolerate abusive comments. So if you are a DGFI troll, please, stop right now. I see that there are some comments like this. We are trying to take them off. But anyone else, the good people out there, if you want to ask a question, please feel free to ask them. John, another question is that, I mean, you touched on that a little bit, and that's about, the European Union and the United Kingdom and countries like Canada and Australia. We usually see that, I mean, after the United States actually imposes these kinds of sanctions, they actually follow the footsteps and impose similar sanctions. Now we know that the European Union last year, I think, had this new law come into effect, which is similar to the Global Magnitsky Act in the US. So can you speak to that a little bit? Like, take European Union and then, like go on with United Kingdom, Canada, and Australia. Uh, do you think there is a possibility that the European Union will be imposing sanctions against RAB? What do you think about United Kingdom? Because we know that in the United Kingdom, the Guernica 37, I think is the name. They have submitted. They have submitted the name of at least 15 people, politicians and RAB commanders, asking for the Brits to impose sanction. So if you can just unpack that a little bit, how does that work? Like,
Yeah.
I know you have worked on Myanmar, and
Mhm.
like you have insight into that. So if you could explain like how this process might work.
Sure. Well, let me just say back up and talk about sanctions in the abstract, not human rights sanctions, but just sanctions. The United States and the European Union and almost every country in the world has a pre-existing capacity to impose sanctions. Um, Before there was the Global Magnitsky Act in the US, in the case of Burma, in the case of several other countries, the United States could sanction somebody pursuant to an executive order by the president. They would invoke their authorities under an obscure law, the Emergency Powers Act, and declare that the issues required sanctions, and then they would impose the sanctions, and Treasury would impose the sanctions by placing people on a list. It's a somewhat infamous list among sanctions experts called the Specially Designated Nationals List, SDN list. And it's for not just human rights abusers, it's for suspected global terrorists, drug traffickers, hackers. North Korea is on the list, Kim Jong-un is on the list, not just for human rights abuses, but for nuclear proliferation. The Taliban is on the list. It's a list of people who are barred from engaging in transactions with U.S. persons or receiving property or holding property or entering the U.S. The Global Magnitsky Act simply created a framework to be put on that list that was more regulated. So it basically it didn't give the president new powers, it simply regulated the process whereby human rights abusers are placed on the list. That's the same thing for the European Union. They already had sanctions authorities. Simply, the foreign ministers of all the EU states could meet and decide on conclusions, as they called it, to sanction somebody, and they would. But it was political. It wasn't very. It didn't have a sort of regulated process or definition of what's a gross human rights abuse. What's the purpose of the sentence? All that. So they passed an own EU law to regulate that, and now they have that. I do expect that the EU will follow suit with at least some of these commanders. It typically takes them longer because they have to get the agreement of all of the EU members and the foreign ministers, who only meet once a month and won't be meeting again until January. So I do expect that that will happen. As for the UK, since Brexit, they've gone their own way, but they have their own version of a global Magnitsky law too. They sometimes move as quickly as the US. Sometimes they move faster than the US. In the case of Burma, they moved faster in one case. In this case, I expect that some Bangladeshi security forces will be listed as well. Australia has recently passed a new law also giving it authority of this type, and I expect that they're a possibility as well as Canada. These laws are becoming increasingly common around the world. Even in Japan, there are parliamentarians who have introduced legislation to create a sanctions-like regime for human rights abusers.
Let's move to another very important question, which is, let's talk about RAB as an unit, as an entity. We know that RAB has been, if we look at reports from Privacy International, for example, they have been on a buying spree, like buying IMSI catchers and forensic
Yeah.
software and whatnot. Like they have been, the West has been supplying RAB with all sorts of tools of repression. Or dual use technology that can be used against journalists, political opposition, dissidents, and these have been used by RAB. Do you think the U.S. sanctions would somehow like impede these acquisitions of surveillance tech and law enforcement tech for RAB?
They do, because those technologies that require licenses, it's going to be impossible to obtain one to sell to RAB or these people. But unfortunately, there are certain types of technology that appear to be sellable without a license, and that is a problem in the US, worldwide. There are companies in the United States that create forms of software and hardware that can be used for surveillance tech, and the US State Department and Commerce Department don't do a good enough job of policing the export of this dangerous, privacy invasive technologies. So we want to thank RAB for providing some examples of that so that we can lobby in the United States so that we can convince US policymakers to adopt tighter controls on a lot of this technology, because it's concerning to see reports that Bangladeshi security officials traveled to the US, to US companies in California, purchased software that can be used to invade the privacy of journalists and human rights defenders. The government says it's to go after to go after terrorism threats and criminal threats. And, maybe that's true for some people, but the point is that this technology can be abused. And when you have a security force that is not just engaged in counterterrorism, but is also engaged in human rights abuses, there have to be stricter controls.
Okay, I actually have some questions coming in, and there is something very interesting. This has to do with, there are reports in the Bangladeshi media that the Army League government wants to work towards somehow managing to convince the US government to leave the bans, and there are proponents of the government, of the ruling party, who are writing on Facebook that Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State, called the Bangladeshi foreign minister and they had a chat, and maybe eventually this is going to lead towards US actually stepping back and saying, hey guys, we were wrong, we are now just withdrawing the sanctions. How does that work? What do you think about that?
Yeah, the United States is not going to withdraw the sanctions simply because Bangladesh asked. That's just not going to happen. But it's a fair question, because any sovereign country that's had a diplomatic punitive measure taken against members of its security force personnel has the right to ask, how do we get these removed? What's the roadmap? What are the benchmarks to have these removed? And it's up to the United States to articulate clearly to Bangladesh government officials who ask, what those benchmarks are. Now, I understand that the ambassador of the United States was summoned foreign ministry, and that then subsequently the Secretary of State placed a call to the foreign minister, which is normal protocol after your ambassador is summoned, a clear the air type of call, where you then issue a statement, as they did, saying that both countries have, a mutual interest in getting along and all those diplomatic niceties and pleasantries. But behind the scenes, the hope would be, and I hope to talk to State Department officials in coming days and find out, the substance of that call. But the hope is that in that call, it was communicated that what the United States wants is for RAB to be disbanded, or at the very least, the cases that have been documented of extrajudicial killings or excessive use of force be thoroughly investigated, and that people be prosecuted where there's evidence that they committed a crime. Will every last person go to jail? No, that's not what they ask for. In other countries, what has happened, what we call remediation, is that countries pledge to investigate and hold people accountable. And then when that's done, the sanctions on the unit are ultimately lifted. It's not always done in a way that we like, but I've seen it happen. In Indonesia, there was a special forces unit that was listed because it committed war crimes during a counterinsurgency operations.
You're talking about Kopassus.
Kopassus, exactly.
Right.
And in East Timor and in West Papua, they were implicated in killings, extrajudicial killings and other abuses and torture. And they were listed for many years. They weren't listed under sanctions because there weren't sanctions back then, but they were barred from receiving assistance from the United States. And the U.S. ambassador told the Indonesian government, you have to hold people accountable and you have to clean out the unit. Like, the people who are implicated can't be in this unit. Now, they didn't really hold that many people accountable. It wasn't great. It wasn't justice, and it wasn't what we wanted. But they did clean up the unit. They fired the most egregious people. Unfortunately, some of them ended up serving in government later, but that's another story. But the unit itself, was flushed out and replaced with newer, younger recruits who were not implicated in abuses. And many years later, the United States lifted its ban on assistance to the unit.
So I actually have a question from one of the audience members, Saiful Alam. He wanted to know that how these sanctions usually get withdrawn or cancelled, and how much time that needs. So I guess, answer to that would be, first, Bangladesh needs to clean house, get rid of all the human rights abuses in RAB, and that and how much time it would need actually depends on Bangladesh.
As far as the individuals go, though, it's different. So the unit, I just laid out what a roadmap is. Basically cleaning up. Either you dissolve the unit, in which case there is no sanction because it doesn't exist. Create if you need some special unit. First of all, why does RAB exist in the first place? If you need a specialized unit to do things, then create a specialized unit. Don't create a unit that you bring people in and then they bring people out. So redesign your whole security force sector. And then secondly, get the military out of policing. Is Bangladesh having a civil war right now? Not to my knowledge, not a civil war in the classical sense. So why is the military involved in police operations? I'm just asking. These are valid questions. But dissolve the unit or clean it out, but you got to do one thing or another. As for the individuals, it's different. Unfortunately, for the individuals, if you are linked to human rights abuses, you're going to be sanctioned, and you're going to remain sanctioned unless you prove somehow that you didn't commit the abuses that have been credibly alleged against you. You have the right to hire a lawyer in the United States and sue the Department of Justice, sue the president, sue Janet Yellen, the Secretary of Treasury, and prove that you are not complicit in human rights abuses. And if you prevail, the sanctions will be removed by a federal judge. It's happened in some other countries. where the case against somebody is weak, which is why Treasury is so careful now to make sure that these cases are strong, because they don't want to have to litigate. They don't want to have to waste time defending their decisions in a court. So they get the facts right. And I very much doubt that the people who are listed are going to have the capacity to demonstrate authoritatively that they are not complicit in human rights abuses that are alleged by us and by the Treasury designations.
Let me take another question. This is from Ramin Zafir, and he wants to. This is sort of a rhetorical comment, I guess. He says, "How do you see a person sanctioned by the United States is still continuing as the IGP?" He's talking about Benazir Ahmed till now, without coming forward with a personal yet official response, but making others of the police force to continue posting social media, on social media posts on Facebook, celebrating the guy. So I think this gentleman is referring to this current campaign in Bangladesh, where police officers are posting saying that Benazir Ahmed is our hero and we love him and we support him, but we have not heard any official response from the police chief to these allegations. I mean, there are two allegations. Number one, as DG of RAB, he was involved in gross human rights violations. Number two, the U.S. State Department says he was involved in the murder, extrajudicial execution of Teknaf Municipal Councillor Ekramul Haq. We have not heard anything from him. So, John, just a quick response from you. How do you see this?
Well, he has to speak for himself. I can't speak for him. But he doesn't have an obligation to say anything. Should he? I don't know. Maybe. I mean, I'd like to hear from him. He doesn't have to. That's not really the issue. I'm more interested in what the Prime Minister's office says and the government itself about the process of what it's going to do to demonstrate that people who are alleged to have committed human rights abuses are investigated. Why do we so rarely see members of the security forces investigated or prosecuted for these killings? How is it possible that just case after case after case of so-called encounter killings or kneecappings or disappearances or extrajudicial killings go uninvestigated, and so rare that people are held accountable? That's a question not for Benazir, but for the government of Bangladesh itself and for Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina herself.
There is another question, a bit related, but this is something I know a lot of our audience members are wondering. Will the US and the international community, or will they, or can they put pressure on Bangladesh government for holding a free and fair election in 2022, 2023? I mean, if you could, speak to this as a human rights advocate.
Yeah, well, we've asked them to, just like we've asked every country, every democratic country in the world to pressure Bangladesh to allow free and open competition and media and civil and political freedoms that accompany an election. When you hold an election, when you hold a so-called election, and I'll put it in quotes, in which the opposition is barred from taking part, or you've imposed on them so many restrictions or subjected their leaders to so many arrests and prosecutions that they, on their own initiative, decide to boycott the election, and you then hold the election at the same time that you're not allowing media to freely operate, and you've, as I said, prosecuted many members of the opposition, and you've outlawed other parties, regardless of the reasons for that. Nobody on the on the world stage, none of the democracies of the world are going to consider that to be a free and fair election, even if you go through the theatrical exercise of, having ballots and having votes be counted and all of that. And so it's less about holding a free and fair election in the abstract and more about creating the atmosphere for a free and fair election, which means...
Here is a related question from Shafiqul Shajib. He wants to know what kind of role these kind of bans can play in the restoration of democracy. So, like, how this can be used as deterrent, like how this can affect the behavior of the security forces when they're carrying out election duties next time. Yeah.
Well, I think it's related in the sense that U.S. officials can say, like EU officials and UK officials can say to Bangladesh, look, you're an enormous country. You export enormous amounts of goods. We want to be close. We want you to be a vital ally in the Indo-Pacific region. But your failure to hold your security forces accountable for abuses and the fact that you've trampled on democracy make it very difficult for us to be a close strategic ally, military or economic ally. We'll still be here. We're not like making you into North Korea here. They're still engaging. The foreign minister called, and Secretary of State called the foreign minister. They're still engaging. We're still, discussing all kinds of issues, from consular issues to economic tariff reductions and a million other things. But the relationship would be even stronger if Bangladesh became more rights respecting. It was not invited to the recent Summit for Democracy in the United States, which we criticized, by the way. We criticized the summit because we thought it wasn't very well advised. But the fact remains, Bangladesh was not invited for a reason. It was invited because the United States could not plausibly claim that Sheikh Hasina was democratically elected in a free and fair process. And so she wasn't invited. But look, neither was Thailand. And Thailand is one of the closest allies the United States has militarily and economically in the region. And it's the same message to them. We're your friend, we're your ally, but we would be even closer.
But John, Thailand has not been sanctioned. I mean, now if you look at what happened,
they may be
China
soon.
And DPRK. Yes.
They may be soon. I mean, we've been putting out reports about torture and killings, and watch this space. You may see more sanctions. These things take time, and they also require a huge amount of documentation. We've been working on RAB for 10 years. We've been documenting abuse for over 10 years. And, painstaking research.
Actually, more than 15, I think. I was working with Human Rights Watch since 2005. So that's like,
more than 15. All the way back to 2007.
Yeah. So here is a very interesting question, which is lots of people are actually wondering about. This is in Bengali. I'll just translate. So this audience member wants to know that are the sanctions going to be just on these 7 people, or there is a chance that more sanctions are going to come? And then he is also referring to reports in the Bangladeshi media quoting different government sources that the United States is actually going to withdraw these sanctions for whatever reasons. So the key question here is, do you think there will be more sanctions?
I don't know. I can't say. But I don't know, but I can say I would find it extraordinary. I've never seen sanctions just get withdrawn without a reason. Typically, it's because a person is able to convince the Treasury Department that they're not who the sanctions relate. I mean, the ironic thing, what is a bigger problem, frankly, is the unfortunate number of people, I don't know how many there are, maybe 10, 15, 20 people in the world who have the exact same name, and
Yeah.
exact
Yeah.
same date
Yeah.
of birth, not date of birth, but like year of birth, because those poor people, will find themselves having trouble
Hmm.
with banking and all this other stuff, which is
Yeah.
why the Treasury Department tries to take such pains to give very precise identifying details, date of birth, passport number, so that if your
But what
name,
I understand, if I am named Benazir, then I am in deep trouble. Like no
no,
matter, no matter. I mean, I'm
unless your date of
yeah,
birth is
yeah.
exactly the same,
Okay, yeah, yeah,
you're not in trouble, but you might have some problems, and that's
yeah. I mean, I mean, whatever names actually are used to flag a transaction and then verify and release. Uh, I will take some. We have like 8 minutes. We are aiming for an hour, so I'll try to get some more user questions. Um, so here is Mashruk Hussein. He wants to know, what happens if after these sanctions the government actually just simply disbands this force, and like maybe create another non-governmental that squad in place of RAB. Do you think that's a possibility? How much shall we be worried about this kind of situation?
it is a worry, and that's why sanctions get adjusted. You can dismantle a force and create a new one and retask it with new people. I mean, yeah, things like that happen, and there's only so much that the existing sanctions can do to deal with that. Um, but that's why sanctions get adjusted over time, and you've seen that, for instance, in Burma, where a unit will shift over to another region, and then another unit will come in, and so you'll see a new unit get designated. Um, Especially in Burma, in Myanmar, where the military moves units around the country, and they're implicated in human rights abuses in different parts of the country. Speaking of Burma, by the way, I just have to say that, like, nobody in doing this, nobody is forgetting the immense generosity of the nation of Bangladesh towards Burmese refugees, and the amazing generosity of the Bangladeshi people towards Burmese refugees, Rohingya refugees.
But John, I have to actually add to that, because I also like get this a lot from Rohingya activists, that they say RAB and other Bangladeshi forces are now like subjecting Rohingya refugees
Yeah,
to extrajudicial executions, and that is something the United international community is sort of silent about. How do you see that?
yeah,
We have seen number of cases where Rohingya refugees, they were found drug dealers and whatnot, and just brutally shot dead.
yeah. Well, so I don't doubt for a minute that there are security issues among refugee camps that need to be dealt with, that there's security issues, protection issues that need to be dealt with. But they can't be dealt with through extrajudicial killings. I mean, that's not law and order, that's vigilante murder. Um, and when I spoke of the generosity of the Bangladeshi nation, I was speaking of the people of Afghanistan and the fact that the border guards opened, and let people cross the Teknaf and didn't shoot them, and thereby saved their lives, quite literally. But unfortunately, the lives of Rohingya in Bangladesh is now miserable because they are caged in open air prisons, prevented from working, receiving an education, receiving healthcare, and subjected, in some cases, to abuse by security forces. Um, Not to mention the unfortunate thousands who've been sent to Bhasan Char. So, the government should be doing a lot more to protect the Rohingya. There's no doubt about it. And we are concerned about that. We've raised it with the Bangladeshi government multiple times. And in fact, over the last few years, we've met more with Bangladeshi government officials to discuss the Rohingya than we have about RAB. Frankly, because talking about RAB with the Bangladeshi government has been, for the most part, fruitless. I mean, it's not a dialogue. It's just a government that seems to not want to listen to the allegations that have been made against them.
Actually, I just received a text from one of my friends on the ground who monitors these cases very closely, and he is watching our show, and he says that 70 plus extrajudicial executions involving Rohingya, which is a terrible number, I have to say. Let's have. I think this would be the last question, but I know this is not directly connected to the topic of the discussion today, but there are lots of Bangladeshi young men and women who are worried about studies abroad, because of the sanctions. So Shobhan Reja, he wants to know that what could be the implications for students, Bangladeshi students who want to study in the West. What do
I
you think?
don't, I don't think there's no clear implication there. I don't think the Bangladeshi citizens are going to face any kind of heightened scrutiny any more than they already do. I mean, all visa applicants face extraordinary scrutiny, not just Bangladeshi citizens. But I don't think there's a concern there. If you're related to somebody who's sanctioned, there are issues involving their capacity to, pay tuition and things like that. But there's no direct implication for Bangladeshi students in the abstract. And then, I'm speaking to you from New York City, where there's a hundreds of thousands of Bangladeshi Americans working and studying, right alongside of us every day.
Thank you so much, John Sifton. It was a wonderful conversation, and I got to learn lots of things. We also took some questions from the audience, and I hope that you will be, engaged on Bangladesh. You will be carrying on with your advocacy work on Bangladesh. I thank you very much for joining me here today, and to our audience. If you like this interview, please like our Facebook page so that you can, if you start following our page, you will get our content right on your feed. And in future, we plan to host these shows, more shows like this, where we'll have experts like John Sifton talking about very important issues and topics that we want to learn more about. Thank you so much. Thank you for listening in. Thank you for logging in.